The Harris campaign is sounding the alarm about the threat posed by Donald Trump. As for Trump, he appears dead set on proving them right. The closing message from the disgraced, convicted, twice impeached, 4 times indicted ex-president is an endless barrage of smears and insults slung at Vice President Kamala Harris, at his political critics, and frankly, anyone standing in the way. And even the country he seeks to lead. Here's what he had to say last night.
They're coming from 181 countries as of yesterday. Right, and we're a dumping ground. We're like a garbage can for the world. That's what's happened. That's what's happened to our. We're like a garbage can. You know, it's the first time I've ever said that. And every time I come up and talk about what they've done to our country, I get angrier and angrier. First time I've ever said garbage can, but you know what? It's a very accurate description.
Interesting strategy to refer to the United States of America as a, quote, garbage can for the world when you're the guy who wants to be the president of that garbage can. Here's how Vice President Kamala Harris responded.
I also do want to address the comment that Donald Trump made about America being the trash can of the world, whatever he said, something along those lines. You know, it's just another example of how he really belittles our country. This is someone who is a former president of the United States, who has a bully pulpit. And this is how he uses it, to tell the rest of the world that somehow the United States of America is trash. And I think, again, the President of the United States should be someone who elevates discourse and talks about the best of who we are and invests in the best of who we are. Not someone like Donald Trump who's constantly demeaning and belittling who the American people are.
Belittling and demeaning the American people is, at this point, something most people have grown numb to, part and parcel of Donald Trump's angry, apocalyptic campaign message. His dark vision of what the country is something that he has made clear he will use to justify taking a wrecking ball to our freedoms and our fellow citizens and our institutions. Team Trump argues that he would be completely unrestrained in doing so if he prevails in November. Here's what former President Barack Obama had to say about the warnings from former Trump officials, General John Kelly and General Mark Milley, at a rally in Georgia last night.
Now, I happen to know John Kelly and Mark Miller. They served under me when I was commander-in-chief. These are serious people. This is a decorated soldier and Marine who served in battle. They are not, quote-unquote, woke liberals. They are people who have never, in the past, even talked about politics because they believe that the military should be above politics. But the reason they're speaking up is because they have seen that in Donald Trump's mind, the military does not exist to serve the Constitution or the American people. He doesn't see being commander-in-chief as a solemn, sacred responsibility, just like everything else. He thinks the military exists to do his bidding, to serve his interests. He said if he's elected, he'll use that military to go after, quote, the enemy within, which he defines as anybody who criticizes him or refuses to bend the knee. He can't handle that. And unlike last time, unlike the first time, he won't have people like John Kelly around to stop him. He'll be surrounded by people who are just as loony as he is and who will let him do what he wants.
In a brand new interview with the Washington Post, General John Kelly is warning of chaos if Trump tries to do what he's saying he's going to do and use American troops against Americans on U.S. soil. From that new interview, quote, to use the U.S. military in terms of domestic law enforcement, it is not the American way. The fear is he will tell them to do something illegal. And that's a really bad thing to do. And then you have generals resigning, and very possibly within the ranks, you have people refusing to do it. These guys are going to follow the law. And Trump deploying the military inside our country against fellow Americans is not some neurotic hypothetical. He actually did want to do it and did try to do it in his first term. Once again, from the Washington Post, quote, as protests swept the nation after the murder of George Floyd and some rioting broke out in Washington, Donald Trump demanded in a White House meeting in June 2020 that 10,000 troops deployed to the U.S. Capitol, or to the Capitol, according to people familiar with the matter. The number, one of them said, seemingly was pulled out of thin air as he sought to counter any perception that he was weak. The incident prompted a study in which Pentagon officials and others in the Trump administration reviewed how to address the president's demand. But Trump never gave the final order to put active duty soldiers in the streets. Standing in Trump's way at the time, the man we've been talking about, his own defense secretary in this instance. Mark Esper writes about it in his book, quote, at this point, even if we were wrong and violence spiked in the city, I didn't want active duty forces quickly available to the president. Esper wrote, quote, we had managed to keep them out of the district so far. Guard forces were now flowing into D.C. in healthy numbers, so I decided to send all active duty units home. I did not inform the White House about these decisions either. I could not trust that they would not reverse my decision. The threat of an unrestrained Donald Trump acting on his autocratic plans looms over the final 11 days of this presidential campaign season. And it's where we start again today. Here at the table, New York Times investigative reporter Mike Schmidt is back, host of MSNBC's Politics Nation and president of the National Action Network. The Reverend Al Sharpton's here. Also joining us, political strategist, MSNBC senior analyst, the man I call my human Xanax because of his read on polls, Matt Dowd is here. And former senior counsel to John Kelly, Kevin Carroll, is here. He signed a new letter backing Kelly's warnings against Donald Trump, along with other former Trump administration officials. Kevin, thank you so much for being here. I'm really grateful to get to talk to you and understand more of what you saw on the day that Donald Trump referred to veterans who had given their life, people like John Kelly's son, as losers and suckers.
I remember that day very well, Nicole. It was Memorial Day of 2017. I had gone to Section 60 to decorate the graves of some fallen men who I knew. And I saw the presidential limousine leaving, and I saw John Kelly standing, very often is on Memorial Day, over the grave of his son. And I went over with my own son, who was 5 at the time. And he was visibly upset, which is not usually the way he presents himself. And I asked what was wrong, and he shook his head no and said he didn't want to talk about it. And my son was perceptive enough to see that this stranger was upset, and he asked him if he'd like to say a prayer. And my son and Kelly held hands and said some Hail Marys over his son's grave. And right after we got out of the administration, I was talking to General Kelly and just trading stories about crazy stuff that we had both seen. And he mentioned that Trump had said over his son's grave, what was in it for him? What was in it for these men that gave their lives for our country? And I said, hey, sir, was that the time when I saw you at Arlington, you were upset? And he goes, that's exactly when it was. It's just really shocking and disgusting language coming from a commander-in-chief.
The story about your 5-year-old son just about does me in here at the beginning of 2 hours. What do you think and feel about a 5-year-old having more empathy and understanding of service than Donald Trump?
Anyone has more empathy than Donald Trump. I mean, he's just an ill man in that sense. And it's part of the reason why Trump despises the military. He doesn't want to use the military because it's trained and equipped to do these missions that he's considering having them do it. It's because he wants to drag the military into the gutter with him. This is a man who lied to avoid service during the Vietnam War. This is a man who, despite his family being financially comfortable, none of his children did any kind of public service after 9/11, much less uniform service. And the lack of empathy is exactly one of the reasons why Trump should not be allowed to be commander-in-chief of the United States, because of the likelihood that he's going to abuse the men and women under his command and order them to do illegal things to other Americans. And he's specifically named sitting members of Congress, such as Adam Schiff and Nancy Pelosi, as people whom he wants the active duty military to somehow take care of. It's a bizarre statement. I mean, the Uniform Code of Military Justice doesn't apply to civilians. What's he suggesting? That they use force against Congress? I mean, it's just absolutely a disqualifying statement for a presidential candidate.
And you have some insight into the conversations happening behind the scenes among generals about what Donald Trump would do if reelected to men like General Milley and Secretary Mattis.
Yeah, my understanding is that the retired general and flag officers are extremely concerned. Their strong preference is to stay out of politics. They look to the example of people like General in the Army George Marshall or Fleet Admiral Leahy, who didn't even vote. Presumably they supported FDR and Truman, but they didn't even vote, so that there was no appearance of them being involved in partisan politics. And that's why I think you're not going to see them come out and make any endorsements, because that cuts against the grain. But they're seriously concerned that if he's elected, that Trump will, for example, order General Milley to be returned to active duty and prosecuted under Article 88 of the UCMJ, which criminalizes the use of contemptuous words against the president and other elected officials. That would be, a gross abuse of legal authority. But facially, there's a statute and a regulation that they could use to try to do that, and they're very afraid that he'll do that. And it will just obviously cause a crisis in civil military affairs if we start having political prosecutions by the military of retirees who have bravely and appropriately spoken out against the president.
Mike Schmidt, in hearing the last couple of days of rhetoric from Trump, I wonder if people, when you hear Kelly's warnings about Trump, it feels like it's about Trump. My sense from the last couple of days and from talking to Kevin is it is as much about what he would do to the institution he reveres, the active duty troops. Can you talk about those concerns he has?
I think this comes back to why Kelly decided to speak out. Kelly has obviously had a long period of time to come forward. There's a lot of people who have wanted to hear from him. He put out a written statement a year ago, but up until this point had not really done much, certainly in the election cycle. Over the summer, I tried to engage him on this and tried to get him to answer these questions, and he told me to get lost. I mean, in a nice way. But so what changes Kelly's mind is what Trump says just a couple of weeks ago, when Trump says that he wants to use the military domestically. And as someone who has studied Kelly and reported on his life, and I wrote this sort of mini biography of him a couple of years ago, to Kelly, the military-civilian divide is something that goes all the way back to George Washington. He believes that George Washington had this foresight to keep the military away from domestic politics in the way that he told some soldiers that wanted to go down to the Continental Congress and make complaints during the Revolutionary War. I'm probably not getting the history 100% right, but this is something that Kelly looks all the way back to Washington on. He looks at Eisenhower on, and he can recite to you the times that the American military has been used domestically, the few times that it has. And he even, when he was a Marine, a younger officer in the Marines in L.A., he took over a battalion or a group of soldiers who had been part of going into L.A. during the riots in the early 90s. And he said that even though Kelly hadn't been in charge of this unit, they complained constantly to him about the fact that they had been used domestically. And that line to him was just too much. And that's why he does the stuff that he's done in the past few days, because it was Trump saying this publicly, and not just saying it as just some random politician, as someone seeking the presidency and saying, this is what I'm going to do if I come back.
There's a new ad out with some of your interview with General Kelly. Let me play that.
Do you think he's a fascist?
He certainly falls into the general definition of a fascist. It's a far-right, authoritarian, ultra-nationalist political ideology and movement characterized by a dictatorial leader, the former president, certainly an authoritarian, using the military to go after American citizens is a very, very bad thing. He admires people who are dictators. He commented more than once that Hitler did some good things too.
If he was left to his own devices, would he be a dictator if he didn't have people around him?
Oh, I think you'd love to be.
When somebody's the president, the authority is total.
I'm Kamala Harris, and I approve this message.
Matt Dowd, what do you think?
Well, it's a very powerful ad. And you know, in the conversation we had the other day, I think this is one of those sort of key moments that I think can be determinative of this race. I actually think, as I was listening to this and as we've talked about this, it's actually a test of us. Honestly, it's a test of us as American voters, because who Donald Trump is exceedingly clear. He's told us who he is. And the interesting thing to me in the last 72 hours with all of this outrageous stuff is that basically he isn't saying, no, that's not what I'm going to do. He just basically says, I don't like General Kelly for telling people the things that I'm going to do. He hasn't denied that this is what he wants to be in the course of this, but it's really a test of us as American voters. I was thinking about what's going to happen by the time we get to election night. And think about this, that even under the scenario that the vice president wins, Donald Trump is going to get at least 5 or 6 million more votes than he got in 2020. Think about that. He's going to get 5 or 6 million more votes. He's going to get nearly 80 million votes. That is a disturbing, Donald Trump is disturbing, and what he wants to do is disturbing. But the idea that this test of us as Americans and who we are and where we want to chart our path as a country and what the Constitution means, and it's a test of us, and that we have 80 million Americans that Donald Trump has clearly said what he's going to say and are voting for him, is incredibly disturbing and means that this work is going to go on long after Election Day.
It's a haunting point, but it needs to be said. I'm going to ask all of you to stick around. Kevin Carroll, your story and your insights and your courage in sharing all of them. I'm sure this is not what you want to do when you leave government. So I appreciate you. Thank you for joining us and starting us off.
Thank you.
I think the bigger problem is the enemy from within, not even the people that have come in and destroying our country. By the way, totally destroying our country. The towns, the villages, they're being inundated. But I don't think they're the problem in terms of Election Day. I think the bigger problem are the people from within. We have some very bad people. We have some sick people, radical left lunatics. And I think they're and it should be very easily handled by, if necessary, by National Guard, or if really necessary, by the military, because they can't let that happen.
So, Reb, I guess my question for you, if the people who are here in this country that lead him to believe we are a garbage can, people he's described as poisoning the blood of America, if his critics in politics and journalism and in the judiciary are worse than them, what does that mean?
It means that we're on the precipice of a dangerous time if he were to win this election. Let's think about the fact that this man is saying out loud that he considers people that are seeking refuge in this country, and I think that has to be managed and dealt with, but they're not garbage, they're human beings. And if to say we are garbage can, we have to be taking garbage in. Well, who decides the difference in those that seek to come here? His in-laws became citizens while he was president. Are they garbage? Or is it only for Mexicans and Venezuelans and Haitians, people of color? And then when you deal with the enemy within, who determines who the enemy within is? Him. And that's why you have to give respect to General Kelly. I may disagree with him on a lot of things. I was not a military guy. When I was of that age, Vietnam War started, I would have been a conscientious objector. They didn't call me. But he believes in this country, as those of us that may disagree with some of the foreign policy believes in the country. Trump apparently doesn't believe in what the country stands for, what the military is supposed to be. He believes in nothing but Donald Trump. And if we're going to have a president that is going to define enemies within based on how you react, relate, or talk about me, then we're going all the way into a question of fascism, as General Kelly said. Lastly, I agree with what was said. When you vote, you know, we've been on this nonpartisan voter registration, voter turnout tour with National Action Network. And I've been saying this is not about whether you like Kamala or Trump. When you vote, you're defining who you are, what you believe in. And you vote for the candidate that is closest to representing what you believe in. So when you go in there, you're not voting for Harris, you're voting for you. And this is your statement. And I think for anybody to say it's all right with me that we're talking about fascism, it's all right with me to go after the enemy within, it's all right to mock military men. Forget protesters, military men that put their lives on the line. And you co-sign that with a vote, it tells us who you are, not who Donald Trump is. We already know who he is.
Mike, do you have any insights into why the other generals who Kevin talked about, General Milley and General Mattis, haven't sort of corroborated or added their voices to what General Kelly has testified to in terms of not if they were the same incidents, but what they saw?
I think that these generals are almost allergic to the politics. I don't think this was Kelly's first choice. This is not something that he wanted to do. And I mean, he's obviously, you know, a grown adult who made his own decision here, but it was something that I think I had to ask him a lot of times to do. And I think that they find themselves in the crosshairs of a political moment. This is the final weeks of a presidential election, and John Kelly's name is out there amidst, you know, whether people are going to vote for Donald Trump or not. And if you're John Kelly and you're someone who hates partisan politics, that is not a place that you want to be. John Kelly is not someone who's, you know, making the rounds on cable television and is then going to go sell a book. You can't find him. I don't know where he is. And, you know, there's no pictures of him. There's no, you know, we have this audio of him. And that's why I think the audio was so important, to hear directly from him. But he's not sitting in front of the cameras. He's not going to go out on the campaign trail. And my guess is that he has very mixed feelings about all of this. And he sits there and probably says, you know, I hate partisan politics. I can't believe my name is out there in this. This is not, I don't think he's particularly comfortable with it. I think if he was comfortable with it, you would see more of him. You know, there was this quote today in the Washington Post that popped up from him.
I know, our hope springs eternal that someday he'll come talk to us. But I understand the point you're making. I guess, Matt Dowd, though, I would bring you in on, and I think it's important to point out that these men aren't afraid of being punished. These are not men who scare. It's not the court-martial, I don't think, is my theory, that they're afraid of. It's what Mike's talking about. It's their allergy to partisan politics. But I guess what I would say, and having the privilege to work in the White House, is that it is difficult to articulate the reverence for people like your son, who also served, and the sort of miracle it is, especially these days, that someone will look at everything that's cheap and easy and shallow and fun and decide, no, I'm going to go serve my country. I'm going to go stand on the line. And these men love them and that in ways that it gives their lives meaning. It probably gives them a sense of not wanting to tarnish that thing that is so precious to them. But that is exactly what Donald Trump is promising to destroy. Because you put your son on the streets of Texas to round up his neighbors, that ruins a soldier's life. And I wonder what you would say as someone who knows this and knows this meaning to those generals who are holding out.
It's interesting that you bring up my son who did, as you say, who did 2 tours in Iraq, and he was actually in the first class boot camp who enlisted knowing they would be sent to war. He was the first class. When he had enlisted, he knew he was going to be sent in the course. So he knew he was going to be in harm's way when he decided to join the Army, because it was already happening in the course of this. And it's funny when you talk, and when I talk to him, just to make this a little personal, about just that service and where it is, they do it with a great deal of humility. They don't want to be thanked. And the other thing, they're not aggressive. Most of them are not aggressive. They don't want to shoot people. That's not what they want to do. They'll do it if they have to do. They'll do it to protect others. They'll do it to serve the country, but they don't want to in the course of this. And somebody like Donald Trump, who everybody says has this appeal to young men, when he disparages their service, I can just tell you, my son, I have 2 brothers, one who was a Marine, one who was in the Coast Guard for 24 years, all 3 of which can't stand the guy. And they can't stand the guy because he has no concept of service besides self.
When we come back, millions of voters casting ballots well ahead of Election Day. It is, yes, a sign of planning. It's also a sign of energy and engagement and activism that we're seeing all across the country. We will be joined by WNBA superstar Renee Montgomery, who used her platform for social change as she has blazed a trail from the basketball court to the boardroom. She'll be our next guest.
This is not 2016 or 2020. The stakes are even higher because over the last years, and in particular the last 8 years, Donald Trump has become more confused, more unstable, and more angry. You see it every day. He has become increasingly unhinged. It's either Donald Trump in there stewing over his enemies list, or me working for you, checking off my to-do list. You have the power to make that decision.
You have the power. That's the closing message from Vice President Kamala Harris. That was from last night in Georgia, warning voters about what would be an unhinged and unchecked Donald Trump. Just ask him if he were to return to the White House. The vice president is hoping her star-studded pitch to thousands helps to energize voters to get out the vote in Georgia. It is a key state. It could help determine the outcome of the election. And so far, a record-breaking number of more than 2 million people have cast their ballots early. That's about 1/3 of all eligible voters in Georgia. It's expected to double before Election Day. Joining our conversation, a friend we haven't seen in way too long, 2-time WNBA champion, now VP and co-owner of the Atlanta Dream, Renee Montgomery is back with us. She's also the subject of a new documentary, A Radical Act, Renee Montgomery. First of all, your sort of street cred in the world of politics is so understated, but you played a huge role in those 2 Senate runoff races. And I wonder if you can just give us your expert take on where things stand in Georgia right now.
I mean, I think people have heard it before, but Georgia's in play, right? Like, I just have to believe that Georgia's in play. Record numbers already just for the turnout. And it's exciting to think about Gen Z and the large amount of Gen Z members that will be voting for the first time, that are already registered to vote for the first time. So just that whole concept of there's going to be some new voices. So when people hear Georgia, you may think of former Georgia, old school Georgia. But don't forget that there's Gen Z that's pulling up. They say the South has something to say. I think Gen Z might have something to say as well. So it's exciting just to see the energy behind it, because the main thing you want in all of this is just at least to have people make their voices heard. And right now with the numbers and the pre-voting and the early voting and the mail-in voting, it's just like the numbers are there. So that's exciting.
And no matter who they ultimately vote for, everyone in Georgia had to be a really smart voter. They passed essentially a voter suppression law after the Georgia election, which was amazing because all the Republicans swore up and down that there was no voter fraud. But it's really a tribute to all of the voters of Georgia that turnout is what it is. It seems like it's had it didn't dampen, even if it's harder, it doesn't seem to have dampened the enthusiasm to vote. Is that accurate, or what are you seeing?
I think sometimes when people try to stop you from doing something, it might make people want to do it a little bit more. So while in the act of trying to make things difficult, I think it opened up some light bulbs in some people's minds like, hold up, why are you trying to keep me so hard from voting? Maybe this is something I should look into. And I think even with the younger gen and a lot of the issues that we're talking about, it seems like, we're talking about things that don't apply to them, but I think they're starting to realize now, seeing the real life situations, these are Gen Z topics that people are running on. These are Gen Z. When you talk about abortion, you're not talking about, hey, listen, I'm all for everybody doing whatever, but I'm just saying this is a Gen Z problem that could arise in a sense of they're going to have to live longer with these laws. They're going to have to be the ones that have to deal with the aftermath of what happens when, like we keep on talking about Project 2025. And it's like, when you think about Project 2025, a lot of these things, Gen Z should be concerned. We've all seen Handmaids. It's not cute. We've all seen these things and we don't want them to happen. And so I think Gen Z is starting to understand, like, they're the ones that's going to have to deal with the effects of all of this.
It's such a good point. You've made it so perfectly. President Obama is, I think, trying to get at the same thing. He's got this new line in his speech where he says, you may not be into politics, but politics is into you. And I mean, to try to put the Supreme Court in front of voters as in the way that you did is such an important thing. You're going to have to live with the consequence of their lifetime appointments longer than anyone older than you will be. Gen Z does have the distinction of being some of the most informed voters. What are you seeing in terms of their enthusiasm for Kamala Harris?
I think they see real, even the social media of it all. I'm on these Twitter streets all the time, and the social media, how information is given and how information is said. Usually politics, there's a term politically correct for a reason. That means you say it all the perfect, fluffy, nice ways because you don't want to say it to hurt anyone's feelings. That's not necessarily the approach that they went with. It was the same group behind the social media of Biden and the Harris administration, but it's a completely different style message. It'll say things in the same way that Gen Z might say it, and it's hilarious and it has comic relief, but it's also informative. So it's going viral every 2 seconds. I think there's a reason that VP Harris is going viral. People can relate to her. They're throwing her in different compilations. Gen Z's making their own content. There's so much content going around about VP Harris and her administration, and it's user made. They have a great social team, but what they're doing and the messages that they're sending out, this Gen Z group is relating to it. They understand. They feel like they can understand it. It's easily digestible. I think those things matter because sometimes politics is not easily digestible. Yeah. You can see by the things that people complain about and what people are mad about and who they're complaining to. You're not complaining to your local officials about things you're mad about. You're complaining to the president about things that are happening in your state. So maybe vote down the ballot and be mad at the right people. So politics needs to be a little bit more easily digestible. And I think that's what VP Harris's administration is doing a great job at in reaching Gen Z.
When we come back, Vice President Kamala Harris continues to reach across the aisle, promising to be a president for all Americans and finding common ground and listening to people on all sides of the political spectrum. It's something our dear friend Fred Guttenberg has been doing, too. He'll be our guest next.
I want my children to know that there is someone sitting in the Oval Office that they can look up to, someone who can be a role model. And I'm incredibly proud, and I know that Vice President Harris will be that.
I have seen a lot of Republicans go up to Liz Cheney and thank her. And they may not be doing it publicly. They may not be doing it publicly because I think she has shown, to your point, extraordinary courage. I've seen Republicans come up to her, and from my vantage point, she's actually not alone.
That was Vice President Kamala Harris and former Congresswoman Liz Cheney making their pitch to voters in a trio of swing states today. As a candidate for all people, from all parties appearing alongside Liz Cheney, who, like so many Republicans, is voting for a Democratic candidate for the first time in her life. It is an extraordinary display of patriotism and bipartisanship in the face of deep cynicism, deep division in our country. Division that our guest, our dear friend, Fred Guttenberg, is working to change by seeking common ground across the political divide. Fred's national tour with former Republican Congressman Joe Walsh, called Two Dads Defending Democracy, wraps up tomorrow. I follow both of you on Twitter, Fred. I've been following every stop. You both are doing exactly what Liz Cheney and Kamala Harris are doing, and that is, with humility and affection and respect for one another, lifting all of us up and giving people hope that it doesn't have to be this way.
It is crazy that I love Joe Walsh. You know?
Not really. He's pretty lovable
but we spent years doing this.
Yeah.
You know, and until one day, and he made the first reach out. But when we started talking and realizing we had each other wrong, and there is space for common ground, even between guys who politically are incredibly different, we realized there was something important here, because that is what democracy is about. Nicole, I am so flipping pissed that there is a candidate running for president who says the things he says, who lies every day, who does think his voters are really stupid, to be quite honest. You can't lie and actually know you're going to get their votes unless you're so cynical and think they're stupid. And Mike Johnson was clear this weekend that he feels the same way about those voters, and it pisses me off. So I'm going to say this. Joe and I are doing what we're doing because I do remain hopeful. I think if we keep talking to people, if we keep explaining why this election matters so much, we're going to be okay. And so tomorrow, we have the final event of our Two Dads Defending Democracy before the election. We hope to continue it post-election if democracy survives. And if everybody listening to this interview and across this country just does a really simple thing, vote, and get everyone you know to vote, we will be okay.
I always think of you, now I think of you sort of with Joe Walsh on your side and Jamie on your shoulder. What are you thinking about her as you go out there and campaign, you know, pouring your heart and soul into this?
So you showed Kamala Harris. I walked Kamala Harris through the school when my daughter was murdered back in March.
I know.
I gave her every chance to say no to doing it because the school was still an untouched crime scene. Yeah. Jamie would love Kamala Harris. Jamie would be all in on this and what Kamala Harris stands for. Jamie had what I would call the greatest bullshit detector in the world. And in 2016, she was screaming at the television saying, "People, are you crazy? Can you not see what that man is about?" That hasn't changed. And so right now, I know Jamie is standing on my shoulders and on this country's shoulders saying, there's one more thing we need to do. We've already started the work. Bipartisan Safer Communities Act, Office of Gun Violence Prevention, led by the Vice President, by the way. It's working. Violent crime is historically down. And I know Jamie doesn't get here to say it herself, but I am her voice. If we vote, the work continues. If we don't, the work stops. I can't make it any more simple than that. Vote.
You're a girl dad forever.
Yes, I am.
And I keep thinking, and I've said this on TV, but I'll ask you what you think. I think girl dads are this silent sleeper vote that they see what Trump is. They see him talking longingly about another man's penis. They see him saying, "I love the women." And they see him calling Vice President Kamala Harris a shit vice president. And they see women dying in childbirth and in pregnancy because of Trump's abortion bans and Trump's picks to the Supreme Court. What conversations do you have with other girl dads?
Donald Trump is demented. And he says things that none of us should want our daughters to hear from another man, okay? But he is demented. He believes men want to hear that. He believes men want to see his performances. I mean, he is a demented fool. And I don't believe men think that way. I don't believe men want their daughters to date or marry men like that. And so I'm with you. I think dads of daughters, but sons also, because you know what? I'm a dad who raised both of his children with a simple motto: always do what's right, not what's easy. Always treat people with respect. You have to live with yourself at the end of the day. And I think men and women across America, whether you're in a red area or a blue area, understand that basic premise of life. We should be ashamed that Donald Trump uses performative art to try and destroy this country that we love, okay? We should be ashamed that this race is as close as it is.
This has been Primetime Weekend. I'm Nicole Wallace. Please tune into Deadline White House and all of our primetime shows weekdays on MSNBC.